A savage scream tore through the dry Montana air as Samuel Reeves pulled on the reins of his chestnut mare, stopping her in her tracks on the lonely path winding to his newly purchased ranch. It was 1876, and after years of drifting, fighting in the war between the states and working cattle drives from Texas to Colorado, he had finally saved enough to buy his own spread just outside of White Rock. The scream came again, desperate, feral, and undeniably human. Samuel dismounted with practiced ease, his worn leather boots hitting the hard, packed earth with a thud. At 32, he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd faced down both men and nature's fury. His hand instinctively went to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip, thumb resting on the hammer as he approached the dilapidated ranch house. The previous owner had died suddenly, leaving the place abandoned for months before Samuel purchased it at a bargain price from the banker in White Rock. The porch sagged, the paint had long since surrendered to the elements, and shutters hung askew from sun-bleached windows. But it was his all 15 acres, the small barn, and the house itself. Another cry came, this time quieter, more resigned. Samuel crouched, peering beneath the weathered porch slats. At first he saw nothing but shadows. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he made out a shape, a human form, curled into itself. "Hello," he called, keeping his voice even. "I ain't looking for trouble, you hurt." No response came, just ragged breathing. Dropping to his knees, Samuel crawled partway under the porch, pushing aside years of accumulated detritus, old bottles, rusted tin cans, and the brittle bones of small animals. The stench of dirt, mold, and human filth assaulted his nostrils. What he discovered made his blood run cold. A woman lay there, her wrists and ankles bound with heavy iron chains secured to the porch support beams. She was filthy, her dress in tatters, her hair a tangled mass around a face smeared with dirt. But it was her eyes that struck him, wild, distrustful, yet still burning with defiance. "Jesus Christ," Samuel whispered, reaching instinctively for her. She recoiled with such violence that the chains rattled against the wooden beams. "Easy now," he said softly, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "I ain't gonna hurt you. I'm Samuel Reeves. I just bought this place." The woman regarded him with naked suspicion. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin burned by the sun in places where it had been exposed through the slats of the porch. "Let me get these off you," Samuel said, indicating the chains. When she didn't respond, he added, "I'm going back to my saddlebag for a moment. Just to get something to break these chains. I'll be right back. You understand?" A barely perceptible nod was his only answer. Samuel returned with a small pry bar he kept for emergencies. Working carefully, speaking in a low, continuous murmur as he would to calm a skittish colt, he managed to break the locks on her chains. As the last one fell away, the woman remained motionless, as if she couldn't believe her freedom was real. "Can you move?" Samuel asked. "Can you come out from under there?" It took coaxing, but eventually she emerged, blinking painfully in the late afternoon sunlight. Standing, she was taller than Samuel had expected, though she swayed dangerously on weakened legs. He reached out to steady her, but she flinched away from his touch. "What's your name?" he asked. She opened her mouth, but only a dry rasp came out. She tried again. "Julia," she managed. "Julia Fairchild. Miss Fairchild, who did this to you?" She shook her head, either unwilling or unable to speak further. "How long were you down there?" Julia held up her hands, extending her fingers twice. 10 days, Samuel asked, horrified. She nodded weakly. "Well, Miss Fairchild, you need water, food, and rest. I ain't leaving you out here, and there's no doctor for 20 miles. The house is mine now, and you're welcome to stay until you're well enough to travel." Julia's eyes widened with fear, and she took a stumbling step backward. "I won't hurt you," Samuel said firmly. "I give you my word, but you need help, and I aim to provide it. You can have the bedroom. I'll sleep in the barn until you're recovered." Something in his steady gaze must have reassured her, because she gave another small nod. When she tried to take a step, her legs buckled. Before she could hit the ground, Samuel caught her, ignoring her initial flinch as he lifted her carefully. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, carrying her up the steps to the house. "But I reckon you've been through enough without adding more bruises from a fall." The interior of the house was sparse. Samuel had only arrived yesterday with his few possessions. A rough wooden table with 2 chairs stood in what passed for a kitchen. A cast iron stove, a single cupboard, and a basin completed the room. Through a doorway was a small bedroom containing only a bed frame with a straw mattress covered by Samuel's bedroll. He laid Julia down carefully, then fetched water from the well out back. She drank greedily when he offered the cup, water spilling down her chin. "Easy now," he cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." As night fell, Samuel built a fire in the stove, heated water, and left it with a scrap of clean cloth beside the bed. "I'll be outside," he told her. "You can wash up if you're able. I'll check on you in a while, bring you something to eat." True to his word, Samuel slept in the barn that night, after ensuring Julia had eaten some of the beans and salt pork he'd cooked. The next morning, he approached the house cautiously, knocking on the front door before entering. Julia was sitting up in bed, looking marginally better. She'd used the water to clean her face and hands. Her hair, though still tangled, had been pulled back from her face, revealing fine features beneath the grime and sunburn. "Morning," Samuel said, keeping his distance. "Thought you might want breakfast." "Thank you," she replied, her voice still raw but stronger than the day before. As Julia ate the simple meal of biscuits and coffee, Samuel leaned against the doorframe, keeping his posture deliberately non-threatening. "Miss Fairchild, I know you've been through an ordeal, but I need to ask, is whoever did this to you likely to come back?" Fear flickered across her face. "He's dead." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You sound mighty certain." "I heard the shots," she said flatly. 4 of them, then nothing. "No one came for me." "Who was he?" "Amos Hartley, the man who owned this place before." She looked down at her hands. "He kept me prisoner in his home for 3 months before putting me under the porch." Samuel felt cold fury rise in him but kept his expression neutral. "Why?" "I was traveling west with a wagon train. My parents died of fever in Kansas. I continued on alone, planning to work as a teacher in Oregon." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "The wagon master was cruel. When we reached Montana territory, I fled during the night. Hartley found me on the road, offered me shelter and work as a housekeeper." She went quiet for a long moment. "At first he was kind, then he started locking me in at night, said it wasn't proper for me to wander, that he was protecting my reputation." A bitter laugh escaped her. "By the time I realized I was his prisoner, it was too late. He took my clothes, gave me only rags to wear. She swallowed hard. "You don't need to tell me more," Samuel said gently. 3 weeks ago, men came looking for him, something about money he owed. He panicked, chained me beneath the porch, and told me if I made a sound, he'd kill me when they left." "But they killed him instead," Samuel concluded. Julia nodded. "I heard the argument, the shots, then nothing for days until you came. The banker in town told me Hartley was found dead in the creek about a mile from here. They figured it was robbers." Samuel ran a hand through his sandy hair. "I don't reckon anyone thought to check for a woman chained under the porch." Over the next few days, a cautious routine developed. Samuel brought supplies from town, proper food, clothing for Julia, medicine for her injuries. He continued sleeping in the barn, giving her space and privacy in the house. Julia's strength returned gradually. Samuel would find her standing at the window, looking out at the land, or sitting on the porch steps, face turned to the sun as if trying to erase the memory of darkness. A week after finding her, Samuel returned from checking his fences to find Julia in the kitchen, her hair washed and combed, wearing the simple dress he'd purchased in town. She'd prepared a meal from their limited stores. "You didn't need to do that," he said, removing his hat as he entered. "I wanted to," she replied. "I can't repay your kindness, but I can at least contribute." They ate in comfortable silence. Afterward, as Samuel rose to clean the dishes, Julia spoke. "Mr. Reeves, I'm grateful for all you've done, but I can't impose on you any longer. I should leave soon." "And go where?" he asked bluntly. "I still have family in Boston, if I can reach them somehow." Samuel dried his hands on a towel. "Miss Fairchild, I won't stop you if that's what you truly want, but winter's coming. The passes will be snowed in soon and travel will be dangerous." "Are you suggesting I stay here?" "With you?" Her tone held suspicion. "Not with me, exactly. I thought I might build a small cabin for myself closer to the creek, give you the house proper. You could stay through winter, regain your strength. Come spring, if you still want to leave, I'd make sure you reached your family safely." Julia studied him, her blue eyes calculating. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Samuel considered his words carefully. "When I bought this place, I was thinking on my future. A man gets tired of drifting. But a home ain't just buildings and land. It needs, I don't know, a purpose, I guess." He shrugged, uncomfortable with such talk. "Having you here, helping you recover, it's given this place meaning beyond just being somewhere to hang my hat." "I can work," Julia offered. "I'm a trained teacher, but I know how to cook, clean, garden." "You don't need to earn your keep," Samuel insisted. "But I want to," she said firmly. "I won't be a charity case, Mr. Reeves." He smiled slightly. "Samuel, please." "Samuel," she repeated, and something passed between them, a silent understanding. As summer faded into fall, Julia's presence transformed the neglected house into something resembling a home. Curtains appeared at the windows, made from fabric Samuel had brought from town. The floors were swept clean and wildflowers stood in jars on the table. Julia planted a small garden, determined to provide for the winter ahead. Samuel, true to his word, began building a small cabin near the creek. But as the weather cooled, it became clear he wouldn't finish before the first snow. By mutual agreement, they established careful boundaries within the house, Samuel taking the main room, Julia keeping the bedroom. Their days fell into a rhythm. Samuel worked the land, repaired fences, and made occasional trips to town for supplies. Julia kept the house, tended the garden, and slowly ventured farther from the buildings, reclaiming her confidence. In the evenings, they would sit by the stove, talking. Samuel told her of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time in the war, his years on cattle drives. Julia spoke of Boston, her parents, her dreams of teaching. One evening in late October, as the first snow dusted the distant mountains, Julia asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why haven't you married, Samuel? You're kind, hardworking, surely there have been opportunities." He stared into his coffee cup. "Had a sweetheart once before the war. She married my cousin while I was away fighting," he shrugged. "After that, I just kept moving. Never stayed in one place long enough, I suppose. And now I'm here," he said simply. "This land needs tending. That's enough for me." But as the words left his mouth, Samuel realized they weren't entirely true. Since Julia had arrived, he'd found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening, to their conversations, to the simple pleasure of sharing meals with someone who understood silence as well as words. The first heavy snow came in November, earlier than usual. Samuel awoke to find the world transformed into a white expanse, the buildings isolated in a sea of white. That evening, as the temperature plummeted and wind howled around the eaves, Julia appeared in the main room with her bedding. "It's too cold in there alone," she explained, avoiding his eyes. "I thought we might keep the stove going through the night if we both stayed out here." Samuel nodded, helping her arrange her blankets near the stove, a respectful distance from his own. But as the night deepened and the wind strengthened, the cold crept in despite the fire. "This is foolish," Julia said finally, teeth chattering. "We'll both freeze to death out of propriety." She moved her blankets closer to his and they lay back to back, sharing warmth. Samuel lay rigid, acutely aware of her presence until exhaustion finally claimed him. In the morning, he awoke to find Julia had turned in her sleep, her face now pressed against his shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still, unwilling to disturb her peaceful sleep, unwilling to acknowledge the comfort her presence brought him. When her eyes fluttered open, she pulled away quickly, murmuring an apology. "Nothing to apologize for," he said gruffly. "Cold night." But something had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained began to dissolve in the face of winter's isolation. Their evenings grew longer, their conversations deeper. Julia spoke of her fears during captivity, of her determination to survive. Samuel revealed the nightmares that still plagued him from the war, the faces of men he'd killed that sometimes visited him in the dark. In December, 3 days before Christmas, Samuel rode to town through deep snow, returning with supplies and a small bundle he kept hidden from Julia. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after dinner, he presented it to her awkwardly. "It's not much," he said. "But I thought you might like it." Inside the brown paper was a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. Julia ran her fingers over the cover, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "How did you know? You mentioned once that your mother read her poems to you." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "The mercantile owner had to send to Helena for it. It's perfect," she whispered. Then, impulsively, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek. Samuel felt the touch of her lips like a brand against his skin. When she pulled back, her eyes were wide, as if she too was surprised by her action. "I didn't get you anything," she said, flustered. "You're here," he replied simply. "That's gift enough." The look that passed between them then was charged with unspoken feelings, possibilities neither had dared acknowledge. That night, as they prepared their bedding near the stove, as had become their custom during the coldest nights, Samuel found himself speaking words he hadn't planned. "Julia, when spring comes and the road's clear, I hope you'll consider staying." She paused, blanket in hand. "As your housekeeper." "No," he said, finding courage from somewhere deep within. "As my wife." The silence that followed seemed endless. Julia's expression was unreadable in the dim light from the stove. "I know it's sudden," he continued hastily, "and I understand if you still want to return to Boston. But these past months, having you here, it's made this place feel like more than just land and buildings. It's made it feel like home." Julia set down her blanket and moved to stand before him. "You saved my life," she said softly. "You cut my chains and gave me back my freedom." "But a marriage should be more than gratitude." "It is," Samuel insisted. "At least, for me it is." "For me as well," Julia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've come to care for you, Samuel, more than I thought possible after what happened." "I would never rush you," he promised. "We could have a long engagement, make sure it's what you truly want." Julia reached out, touching his face gently. "I don't need more time to know my own heart." She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not out of gratitude, but because I've found something with you I never expected to find again: trust, and with it, love." Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he took hers. "May I kiss you?" he asked. In answer, Julia leaned forward, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tender, hesitant at first, then deepening with shared emotion. When they separated, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you'll never be a prisoner again, Julia. Not of chains, not of fear, and not of me." "I know," she said simply, and in those 2 words lay a world of trust. They were married in April 1877, when the snow had melted and the first wildflowers bloomed across the land. The ceremony was small, just a justice of the peace, and a few neighbors Samuel had come to know over the winter months. Julia wore a dress of pale blue with wildflowers in her hair. As spring turned to summer, the small ranch flourished under their joint care. Samuel built an addition to the house, a proper kitchen and a second bedroom. "For the future," he said with a smile that Julia returned with knowing eyes. In town, people marveled at the transformation of both the Reeves ranch and its owner. The quiet, solitary cowboy who had arrived the previous year was now a man who spoke with pride of his wife's garden, who ordered books from Helena for the small library they were building, who planned for a future that stretched years ahead. Some whispered about Julia's mysterious appearance. There had been talk when Samuel first brought her to town, questions about where she'd come from. But Samuel's fierce protectiveness and Julia's quiet dignity soon silenced the gossip. By their first anniversary, Julia's belly had begun to swell with child. Samuel found her one evening standing on the porch, looking out at the land that had once been her prison and was now her home. "Any regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Not one," she answered, taking his hand and placing it on her growing stomach. "This land saw the worst moment of my life. Now it will see the best." The baby, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Julia's mother, was born in the winter of 1878. As Julia held their daughter and Samuel sat beside them on the bed, his arm around his wife's shoulders, they both felt the completion of a circle. What had begun in darkness beneath the porch had transformed into a family forged by choice, by respect, and by love. In the years that followed, the Reeves ranch prospered. 2 more children joined Elizabeth, a son, William, and another daughter, Rose. Julia eventually opened a small school in their home, teaching not only her own children but those from neighboring ranches. Samuel expanded their holdings, building the ranch into one of the most successful in the county. But he never forgot the day he'd found Julia beneath the porch, and each year on that anniversary, he would present her with a small key symbolic of the freedom he had given her, and that she, in turn, had given him. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard that had once held such darkness, Julia turned to Samuel. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't heard my cry that day?" Samuel took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there a decade before. "I try not to," he admitted, "but I do believe some things are meant to be, even when they come from terrible beginnings." "When I was chained under that porch," Julia said quietly, "I made a promise to myself that if I survived, I would live fully, completely. I wouldn't let fear chain me again." She smiled at him. "I never dreamed that promise would lead me here to this life with you." "When I cut those chains," Samuel replied, "I was just doing what any decent man would. I never imagined I was cutting a path to my own future, my own happiness." As twilight settled over the Montana landscape, Samuel and Julia Reeves sat together, hands entwined, watching their children and the ranch that had become the physical embodiment of their journey from darkness to light, from captivity to freedom, from strangers to beloved partners. The chains that had once bound Julia beneath the porch had long since been buried deep in the earth of their land, a deliberate act they had performed together on their wedding day. In their place had grown a love as expansive as the Montana sky, as enduring as the mountains on the horizon, and as real as the family they had built together. What had begun with a cry of despair had transformed into a life filled with joy, with purpose, and with the quiet, steady love of 2 people who had found in each other not just salvation, but completion.